Barren Texas Courage. Savannah Savvy Hollister had built her life around the law, never bending the rules. But when Colt Callahan, an outlaw with a past tangled in hers, was thrown into her jail, she knew her careful world was about to crumble. He leaned against the bars, his smirk slow and knowing. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" he murmured. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The Badge and the Burden. The desert sun beat down on Redemption, Arizona, with the relentless fury only the heart of summer could muster. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, swirling miniature tornadoes that mirrored the turmoil brewing inside Savannah Savvy Hollister. She stood on the weathered porch of the sheriff's office, the tin star pinned to her chest feeling heavier than usual. It was a weight she'd carried with stoic pride for the last decade, ever since her father, the legendary Sheriff Thomas Hollister, had fallen to a bandit's bullet. She'd inherited more than just his badge, she'd inherited his unwavering commitment to justice, a commitment that had become both her shield and her prison. Savvy adjusted the worn leather of her gun belt, the familiar scent of gun oil, and sweat a small comfort in the oppressive heat. Her eyes, the color of the desert sky after a rare rain, scanned the quiet main street. The wooden buildings, their paint peeling from years of sun and neglect, seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Even the usual midday bustle of the Golden Nugget Saloon, directly across the street, was muted. It was a quiet that felt ominous, a prelude to a storm she couldn't quite name. She was a woman built for this life, though many had doubted her at first. Tall and lean, with hands calloused from years of handling horses and firearms, Savvy had a quiet strength that commanded respect. Her auburn hair, usually braided tightly down her back, was streaked with silver, a testament to the harshness of the frontier and the burdens she carried. The lines around her eyes, etched by sun and worry, spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was a rugged, undeniable appeal to her, a resilience that drew people in. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from down the street was the only sound that broke the silence. It was a familiar rhythm, a heartbeat of the town, but today it felt like a countdown. Savvy pushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, her gaze lingering on the hitching posts in front of the jail. Empty. That was about to change. A cloud of dust on the horizon signaled the approach of riders. Savvy's hand instinctively moved to the butt of her Colt Peacemaker, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves. She recognized the lead rider, Deputy Earl, a grizzled veteran who had served alongside her father. Beside him, bound and slouched in the saddle, was the reason for her unease. Colt Callahan. The name itself was a whisper of trouble, a legend woven from equal parts admiration and fear. He was an outlaw, a rustler, a man who lived outside the law, yet he possessed a strange code of honor that often blurred the lines between right and wrong. Savvy had known of him most of her life. Their paths had crossed in childhood, brief encounters filled with a strange mix of animosity and fascination. He was the wild, untamed spirit she secretly envied, the freedom she could never allow herself. As they drew closer, Savvy could see the details of his face. He was even more striking than she remembered. Dark hair, unruly and windblown, framed a face that was all sharp angles and hard edges. His eyes, the color of dark whiskey, met hers with a defiant glint. There was a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a memento of a life lived on the edge. He was handsome, undeniably so, but it was a dangerous beauty, the kind that promised trouble with every breath. Earl dismounted, his movements stiff with age and the long ride. He jerked his head towards Colt. Caught him trying to move a herd of stolen cattle across the border, Savvy. Had a couple of his boys with him, but they scattered when we showed up. He didn't even try to run. Savvy nodded, her gaze never leaving Colt's. Bring him in. Colt swung down from his horse with a surprising grace, despite his bonds. He moved with the easy confidence of a predator, even in captivity. As he passed her, he paused, his shoulder brushing hers. A shiver, unexpected and unwelcome, ran through her. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble that sent another tremor through her. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. The scent of dust, leather, and something indefinably him filled her senses. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" The words were a challenge, a taunt, and a truth all wrapped into one. Savvy stiffened, her jaw tightening. "You broke the law, Callahan. You'll face the consequences." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil his presence stirred within her. He smirked, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made her heart pound a little faster. "Always so righteous, Savvy. But things ain't always black and white, are they? Especially out here." Earl shoved him forward, breaking the spell. "Get moving, Callahan." Savvy watched as they led him into the jail, the heavy iron door clanging shut behind him. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, a finality that felt strangely hollow. She remained on the porch, the sun suddenly feeling colder, the silence more profound. She ran a hand through her hair, trying in vain to calm the turmoil he had reawakened. Colt Callahan was a complication she didn't need, a ghost from a past she'd tried to bury. He was a reminder of the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of a life beyond the confines of the law, a life where freedom wasn't a forbidden word. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. A moonlit night, years ago, when she was barely 16. She'd snuck out of the house, restless and yearning for something she couldn't name. She'd found him by the creek, sitting on a fallen log, his silhouette stark against the moonlit water. He hadn't seen her at first, and she'd watched him, mesmerized by the raw, untamed energy that radiated from him. He was playing a harmonica, the mournful melody weaving a spell around them. When he'd finally noticed her, he hadn't been angry, as she'd expected. He'd simply smiled, a slow, easy smile that had made her heart flutter. They talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He'd spoken of his dreams, of a life free from rules and restrictions. She'd listened, captivated, feeling a connection to him that defied logic and reason. Then he'd leaned in, his eyes dark and intense, and for a moment, she'd thought he was going to kiss her. But he hadn't. He'd simply touched her cheek, his fingers rough against her skin, and whispered, "You're too good for this life, Savvy. Don't let it break you." The memory faded, leaving a bitter ache in its wake. He was right. She was too good for this life. And yet, here she was, trapped by duty and circumstance. And now, he was back, a threat to everything she held dear, and a temptation she couldn't afford to indulge. She walked back inside the office, the familiar scent of old paper and gun oil doing little to soothe her nerves. She sat down at her father's old desk, the wood worn smooth by years of use. She opened the top drawer and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside was a faded picture of her parents, their faces young and full of hope. She traced their images with her fingertip, a familiar pang of grief tightening her chest. She had to stay strong. For them. For the town. For herself. She couldn't let Colt Callahan, or the feelings he stirred within her, unravel everything she'd worked so hard to build. But as she looked out the window at the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she knew that keeping him locked up was only the beginning of her troubles. The real battle would be keeping him out of her heart. The cell door was a barrier, but not nearly as strong as the ones she had meticulously crafted around herself, her heart. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Return. The jail was a small, sturdy building made of thick stone blocks, designed to withstand both the elements and any attempts at escape. It held only 4 cells, 2 on each side of a narrow corridor. Colt was in the last cell on the right, the one furthest from the office, offering him a sliver of a view of the dusty main street through the small, barred window. He sat on the edge of the cot, seemingly unconcerned by his confinement. Savvy entered the jail, the keys jingling in her hand, the sound echoing in the confined space. The air was cooler inside, tinged with the damp smell of stone and something else, something akin to despair, a residue of the countless souls who had spent time within these walls. She tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened as she approached his cell. "Comfortable, Callahan?" she asked, her voice deliberately devoid of emotion. He looked up, his whiskey-colored eyes meeting hers. "Could be worse. Seen worse, that's for sure." He leaned back against the wall, his posture relaxed, almost arrogant. "Though I reckon the company could use some improvement." Savvy ignored the jab. "You know why you're here. Stolen cattle, you said." He shrugged. "Seems a bit harsh, considering they were just wandering around, looking for a good home." "They had a brand, Callahan. A brand that wasn't yours." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Details, details. Always the stickler for details, Savvy." She stepped closer to the bars, her hands gripping them tightly. "This isn't a game, Colt. This is serious." "Oh, I know it's serious," he said, his voice suddenly dropping, losing its playful edge. "Everything's serious out here. Life, death, the choices we make, they all got consequences." His gaze held hers, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability, perhaps even regret. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked by his usual bravado. "So, what happens now, Sheriff? You gonna hang me at dawn?" Savvy sighed, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her. "I haven't decided yet. There'll be a trial, of course. Judge Thompson will be here next week." "Thompson?" Colt snorted. "That old windbag? He'll be swayed by the highest bidder. This whole town is." The accusation stung, partly because it held a grain of truth. Redemption, like many frontier towns, had its share of corruption. Powerful ranchers often held sway, and justice could sometimes be bought and sold. But Savvy had always strived to be different, to uphold the law fairly, regardless of influence or pressure. "I won't let that happen," she said firmly. "I'll make sure you get a fair trial." He raised an eyebrow, a skeptical look on his face. "You really believe that, don't you? You still believe in the good of people, even after all this time?" "I have to," she said, her voice softer now. "If I don't, then what's the point?" He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. "You haven't changed much, Savvy. Still the same idealistic girl I met by the creek all those years ago." The mention of that night, the memory she'd tried to suppress, sent a fresh wave of unease through her. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "We were children, were we?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I seem to recall things being pretty clear even back then." She turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "I need to get back to the office." "Running away, Sheriff?" he called after her. "That ain't like you." She stopped at the door, her back to him. "I'm not running," she said quietly. I'm trying to do my job." "And what about what you feel, Savvy?" he asked, his voice low and insistent. "Does that have any place in your job?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. She walked out, the heavy door clanging shut behind her, leaving her alone with the unsettling questions he'd raised. Back in her office, Savvy sat at her desk, staring at the paperwork in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. Colt's words echoed in her head, forcing her to confront the emotions she'd tried so hard to keep buried. What did she feel? It was a question she'd avoided for years, ever since her father's death. She'd built walls around her heart, protecting herself from the pain and vulnerability that came with caring too much. But Colt had a way of chipping away at those walls, of making her feel things she thought she'd forgotten. The memory of that night by the creek resurfaced, vivid and insistent. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd touched her cheek, it had awakened something within her, a longing for something more than the duty and responsibility that defined her life. She remembered the harmonica's mournful melody, the way it had seemed to speak to her soul. And she remembered the feeling of his hand on her skin, the brief, electric connection that had sent shivers through her. It was a moment of innocence and possibility, a glimpse of a different path she could have taken. But she hadn't taken it. She'd chosen duty, honor, the legacy of her father. And now, years later, she was facing the consequences of that choice. Colt Callahan was a living embodiment of the path not taken, a reminder of the wild, untamed part of herself she'd suppressed. A knock on the door startled her. It was Earl, his weathered face creased with concern. "You all right, Savvy? You look a bit pale." She forced a smile. "I'm fine, Earl. Just tired." He didn't look convinced. "That Callahan, he's a troublemaker. Always has been. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," she said, though she knew it was a lie. Colt was already under her skin, a thorn she couldn't easily remove. Earl hesitated, then said, "There's something else, Savvy. I found this tucked in Callahan's saddlebag." He held out a small, worn leather pouch. Savvy took it, her fingers brushing against Earl's. The pouch felt heavy, its contents a mystery. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding with a sense of foreboding. Inside, nestled amongst a few coins and a faded playing card, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was identical to the one she wore around her neck. She stared, transfixed at the way it mirrored her most prized possession. The implications of why he would have this churned her stomach. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in twilight. Savvy's fingers trembled as she held the locket, the cold metal a stark contrast to the sudden heat that flushed her skin. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. The locket she wore, the one her father had given her mother, was unique. He'd had it specially made by a silversmith in Santa Fe, a one-of-a-kind design featuring intertwined roses and thorns. She'd never seen another like it. Until now. "Where did you find this, Earl?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Earl shifted uncomfortably. "Like I said, tucked in Callahan's saddlebag. Hidden away, like he was trying to keep it secret." Savvy opened the locket. Inside, instead of a picture of her parents, was a miniature portrait of a woman she didn't recognize. She was young, beautiful, with dark hair and piercing eyes. There was a sadness in her gaze, a hint of defiance, that resonated with Savvy. Who was she? And why did Colt Callahan have a locket identical to her own? Did he say anything about it? Savvy asked, her mind racing. Earl shook his head. Not a word. Just smirked when I found it, like he was expecting me to. Savvy closed the locket, the snap echoing in the quiet office. 1,000 questions swirled in her head, each more unsettling than the last. Was it a coincidence? A cruel joke? Or was there a deeper connection? A hidden link between her family and Colt Callahan that she'd never known? She needed answers, and she knew only one person who could provide them. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. Keep an eye on things, Earl. I'm going to talk to Callahan. Earl looked concerned. You sure that's wise, Savvy? He's a slippery one. He might try to manipulate you. I can handle him, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she could. There was something about Colt that disarmed her, that made her question her own judgment. But she couldn't let that stop her. She had to know the truth. The twilight was deepening, casting long shadows across the main street as she walked towards the jail. The air was cooler now, a welcome relief from the day's heat. The saloons were starting to come alive, the sounds of music and laughter spilling out into the street. But Savvy barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the man waiting for her in the last cell. She found him standing by the window, his silhouette framed against the fading light. He turned as she approached, his eyes glinting in the dimness. Back so soon, Sheriff? He asked, his voice a low murmur. Couldn't stay away? She ignored the taunt, holding up the locket. What is this, Colt? And don't lie to me. He looked at the locket, his expression unreadable. Looks like a locket, he said casually. It's identical to mine, Savvy said, her voice tight with anger and confusion. The one my father gave my mother. How did you get it? He shrugged. Found it. Found it where? She pressed, stepping closer to the bars. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. Does it matter? It matters to me, she said fiercely. This is my family we're talking about. My history. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. And what if your history is intertwined with mine, Savvy? What if the truth is something you don't want to know? His words sent a chill down her spine. Tell me, she demanded. He sighed, a hint of weariness in his voice. It belonged to my mother, he said quietly. Her name was Rose. Savi's heart skipped a beat. Rose. The intertwined roses on the locket. It was starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. Your mother? She asked, her voice trembling. Who was she? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She was a friend of your father's, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Savi felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. A friend? She repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. What kind of friend? He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. The kind that gets a locket made special, he said softly. The kind that keeps secrets. The implication was clear. Her father, the upright, honorable Sheriff Thomas Hollister, had had an affair. And Colt Callahan, the outlaw she'd always seen as her enemy, was her half-brother? The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Savi gripped the bars, her knuckles white. No, she whispered. That's not possible. Isn't it? Colt asked, his voice laced with a bitter sadness. Look at the locket, Savi. Look at the woman inside. She looks like you, doesn't she? We share the same blood. Savi stared at the portrait again, seeing the resemblance for the first time. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, it was undeniable. Why didn't you tell me before? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Would you have believed me? He countered. You were so determined to see me as the bad guy, the outlaw. You wouldn't have wanted to know the truth. But why keep it a secret? She pressed. Why now? He smiled, a sad, twisted smile. Let's just say I needed a bargaining chip. Something to ensure my survival. Savi's mind reeled. He was using their shared blood, to get out of jail. It was a cruel, calculated move, and yet, she couldn't entirely blame him. He was a desperate man, fighting for his life. What do you want, Colt? She asked, her voice heavy with resignation. He stepped closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper. I want you to let me go, Savi. Tonight. Before Thompson gets here. She stared at him, her heart pounding. It was an impossible request. It went against everything she believed in, everything she'd stood for. But the alternative, the thought of handing him over to a corrupt judge, knowing he was her brother, was unbearable. And if I do? She asked, her voice barely audible. Then the secret stays buried, he said, his eyes locking with hers. No one ever needs to know. We can both go back to our lives, pretending this never happened. It was a tempting offer. A chance to erase the past, to protect her father's reputation, to avoid the scandal and shame that would surely follow if the truth came out. But it was also a betrayal of her own principles, a compromise she wasn't sure she could live with. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. The sounds of the town faded into the background, leaving only the two of them, locked in a desperate bargain, their fates intertwined by a secret from the past. Savi looked into Colt's eyes, searching for a sign of deception, a hint of the outlaw she'd always believed him to be. But all she saw was a reflection of her own turmoil, her own conflicted heart. The sun dipped below the horizon. Chapter 4. The Outlaw's Code. The last sliver of sun vanished, plunging the jail into near darkness. Only a faint glow from the lanterns in the office spilled into the corridor, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Savi felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, crushing her with its implications. Letting Colt go was a betrayal of her duty, a violation of the oath she'd sworn. But keeping him, knowing he was her brother, and handing him over to a potentially corrupt judge, felt like a betrayal of her own blood. How can I trust you, Colt? She asked, her voice raw with emotion. You're an outlaw. You've lied. You've stolen. Why should I believe you'll keep your word? He stepped closer to the bars, his face partially illuminated by the faint light. Because I'm giving you my word, Savi. And out here, a man's word is all he's got. It's the only currency that truly matters. He spoke of an outlaw's code, a twisted sense of honor that governed their lives outside the law. It was a code built on loyalty, respect, and keeping one's promises, even in the face of adversity. It was a strange, paradoxical code, but it was the only code he knew. I've never broken my word to anyone, Savvy, he continued, his voice low and earnest. Not even to my enemies. And I'm certainly not going to break it to my own sister. The word sister hung in the air between them, a heavy, unfamiliar weight. It was a truth she was still struggling to accept, a reality that shattered everything she thought she knew about her family, about herself. What about the cattle? She asked, trying to cling to some semblance of her former certainty. The ranchers, they'll want justice. Colt shrugged. They'll get over it. Cattle come and go. Besides, I only took from the ones who could afford it. The ones who were lining their pockets at the expense of the smaller homesteaders. It was a Robin Hood justification, a way of rationalizing his actions. Savvy knew it wasn't entirely true, but she also knew that Colt had a reputation for helping those in need, for standing up to the powerful and corrupt. It was another layer to his complex, contradictory character. And what about your men? She asked. The ones who were with you? They're gone, he said. Scattered to the winds. They'll find their own way. They know the risks. Savvy sighed, running a hand through her hair. She felt torn, pulled in two different directions. Her head told her to uphold the law, to do what was right, regardless of her personal feelings. But her heart ached for this newly discovered brother, this man who was both a stranger and a part of her. If I let you go, she said slowly, you have to promise me something. You have to leave this life behind. No more rustling, no more running from the law. You have to start over somewhere else. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. That's a big ask, Savvy. This life, it's all I know. It's not all you are, she said firmly. You're more than just an outlaw, Colt. You have a chance to be something better. Something different. He was silent for a long moment, considering her words. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of hope, perhaps, or maybe just a longing for a different life. And if I refuse? He asked finally. Then I'll do my duty, she said, her voice heavy with regret. I'll hand you over to Thompson and let the law take its course. He knew she meant it. He saw the steel in her eyes, the unwavering determination that had made her the sheriff she was. He also saw the pain, the sadness that she couldn't hide. All right, Savvy, he said softly. I'll do it. I'll leave redemption. I'll start over. A wave of relief washed over her, mingled with a profound sense of unease. She was breaking the law, betraying her oath, but she was also saving her brother. It was a choice she hoped she wouldn't regret. I'll give you a horse and some supplies, she said. Enough to get you started. But you have to leave tonight, before anyone finds out. Agreed, he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. And Savvy, thank you. The gratitude in his voice was unexpected, and it touched her deeply. She unlocked the cell door, the metal grating against the stone, a sound that echoed the breaking of her own internal barriers. He stepped out, free, and for a moment, they stood face to face, the tension between them palpable. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence filling the narrow corridor. She could smell the familiar scent of leather and dust, mingled with something else, a hint of vulnerability that she'd never noticed before. Go, she said, her voice a little unsteady. Get out of here before I change my mind. He nodded, his eyes lingering on hers. Then, he turned and walked towards the back door of the jail, his steps silent and purposeful. Savvy watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and regret. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. As he disappeared into the darkness, she wondered if she'd ever see him again. And she wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if the outlaw, for once, actually intended to follow her code. Only time would truly tell, after all. She took a steadying breath as Colt faded into the darkness. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Desert Wind. The news of Colt Callahan's escape spread through Redemption like wildfire. By sunrise, the town was buzzing with speculation, accusations, and outrage. Savvy had expected the backlash, but the intensity of it still took her aback. She'd concocted a story about a daring midnight raid, claiming that Colt's men had overpowered her and Earl, freeing their leader. It was a flimsy tale, full of holes, but she'd hoped the townsfolk's fear of Colt and his gang would be enough to make them accept it, at least for a while. Earl, bless his loyal heart, had backed her up, embellishing the story with details of a fierce gunfight and a desperate struggle. He'd even added a few self-inflicted bruises for good measure. He knew the truth, of course, but he'd stood by her, his loyalty unwavering. But not everyone was convinced. The ranchers, particularly Jedediah Stone, the wealthiest and most influential man in the county, were furious. Stone had lost the most cattle to Colt, and he was demanding justice, vengeance, and the return of his property. He'd stormed into Savvy's office, his face red with anger, his voice booming with threats. "This is an outrage, Sheriff," he'd bellowed, slamming his fist on her desk. "You let that outlaw escape. You're either incompetent or in cahoots with him." Savvy had met his fury with a calm she didn't feel. "I assure you, Mr. Stone, I had nothing to do with Callahan's escape. We were ambushed, outnumbered. There was nothing we could do." "Nothing you could do?" Stone scoffed. "You're the sheriff. It's your job to protect this town, to uphold the law." "And I intend to do just that," Savvy said firmly. "I'll organize a posse. We'll track Callahan down and bring him to justice." It was a lie, of course. She had no intention of hunting down her own brother, but she had to maintain the facade, to keep up appearances, to protect herself and Colt. Stone had remained skeptical, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I'm holding you personally responsible, Sheriff. If Callahan isn't caught, if my cattle aren't returned, you'll be answering to me. And to the entire county." He'd stormed out, leaving Savvy with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew Stone was a powerful enemy, a man who could make her life very difficult. He had influence with the territorial governor, with the judges, with the newspapers. He could ruin her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for. The whispers started soon after. Whispers in the saloons, in the general store, on the street corners. Whispers about the sheriff who'd let the notorious Colt Callahan escape. Whispers about her incompetence, her weakness, her possible collusion. Savvy tried to ignore them, to focus on her work, but the whispers were like sand in the wind, insidious and pervasive, eroding her confidence, her sense of self. She felt the eyes of the townsfolk on her, judging her, doubting her. The respect she'd earned over the years, the trust she'd built, was crumbling around her. She found herself spending more time alone, seeking solace in the quiet solitude of the desert. She'd ride out to the edge of town, to a small rise overlooking the vast expanse of sand and scrub. She'd sit there for hours, watching the sunset, the colors painting the sky in breathtaking hues of orange, purple, and red. The desert was a harsh, unforgiving landscape, but it was also beautiful, majestic, and strangely comforting. It was a place where she could be herself, where she could drop the facade of the strong, stoic sheriff and let her emotions flow freely. She thought about Colt, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he was keeping his promise. She hoped he was. She hoped he'd found a new life, a new beginning, far away from redemption and the shadows of his past. But she also felt a pang of guilt, a nagging doubt that she'd made the wrong decision. She'd broken the law, betrayed her duty, and for what? For a brother she barely knew, an outlaw who might very well return to his old ways. The desert wind whipped around her, carrying the whispers of doubt, the echoes of her own conflicted heart. She closed her eyes, letting the wind wash over her, trying to find some peace, some clarity, in the vastness of the landscape. She thought about her father, about the legacy he'd left behind. He'd always taught her to be strong, to be just, to uphold the law no matter what. Would he have understood her decision? Would he have forgiven her? She opened her eyes, looking out at the endless horizon. She didn't know the answers. All she knew was that she had to keep going, to keep fighting, to try to make things right, even if it meant facing the consequences of her actions. As darkness settled over the desert, Savvy turned her horse back towards town. The lights of redemption twinkled in the distance, a beacon in the vast emptiness. She knew the whispers would still be there, waiting for her. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Earl, she had her memories of her father, and she had the faint, flickering hope that Colt would keep his word. And somehow, that had to be enough. She took another breath, then headed toward the noise. Chapter 6. Scars that never healed. The days following Colt's escape were a blur of activity and anxiety for Savvy. She organized posses, sent out telegrams to neighboring towns, and endured endless meetings with angry ranchers and suspicious townsfolk. She maintained the pretense of hunting Colt, while secretly hoping he was far away and safe. The pressure was mounting. Jedediah Stone continued his relentless campaign against her, fueling the rumors and undermining her authority. Judge Thompson arrived in town earlier than expected and immediately summoned Savvy to his makeshift courtroom in the back of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Thompson was a stern, imposing man with a reputation for harsh sentences and a close relationship with the wealthier ranchers, including Stone. He wasted no time in expressing his displeasure. "Sheriff Hollister," he said, his voice booming across the room, "I've heard disturbing reports about your handling of the Callahan case. Care to explain yourself?" Savvy stood before him, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. "Your Honor, as I've already stated, Callahan's men ambushed us. We were outnumbered and outgunned." "Outnumbered?" Thompson scoffed. "By a handful of outlaws? You're the sheriff, Hollister. You're supposed to be able to handle such situations." "We did the best we could," Savvy said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "But Callahan is a dangerous man. He's resourceful and cunning." Or perhaps, Thompson said, his eyes narrowing, he had help. Help from someone on the inside. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Savvy felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, judging her, doubting her. "That's a serious accusation, Your Honor," she said, her voice dangerously low. "I suggest you have proof before you make such claims." Thompson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. "I have witnesses who claim to have seen you talking to Callahan alone, late at night, in the days leading up to his escape." Savvy's heart sank. She'd been careful, or so she'd thought. But in a small town like Redemption, secrets were hard to keep. Someone had seen her, and now her lies were catching up to her. "I was interrogating him," she said, trying to maintain a calm facade. "Trying to get information about his plans." "Interrogating him?" Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Or conspiring with him?" "I would never betray my oath, Your Honor," Savvy said, her voice filled with righteous indignation. But even as she spoke the words, she felt a pang of guilt. She had betrayed her oath, albeit for a reason she believed was just. Thompson remained unconvinced. "I'm placing you under investigation, Sheriff Hollister," he announced. "You'll be relieved of your duties until further notice. Deputy Earl will take over in the interim." Savvy felt a wave of despair wash over her. She'd lost her badge, her authority, her reputation. Everything she'd worked for was gone, all because of her decision to help Colt. She left the saloon, her head held high, but her heart heavy with defeat. The whispers followed her, louder and more insistent than ever. She felt the weight of the town's disapproval, the sting of their betrayal. She walked back to the sheriff's office, her boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. She entered the empty office, the familiar scent of old paper and gun oil doing little to comfort her. She sat down at her father's desk, feeling the weight of his absence, the emptiness of his legacy. She opened the top drawer and pulled out the silver locket, the one containing the picture of her parents. She stared at their faces, young and full of hope, and a wave of grief washed over her. She'd failed them. She'd failed the town. She'd failed herself. As she sat there, lost in her despair, a memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. A memory of her father, not as the legendary sheriff, but as a man, flawed and vulnerable. She was 10 years old, and she'd overheard an argument between her parents. It was late at night, and their voices were hushed, but she could hear the anger and the pain in their words. Her mother was accusing her father of something, of being with another woman. Her father was denying it, but his voice lacked conviction. Savvy had crept closer, hiding in the shadows, listening to their whispered accusations and denials. She'd heard her mother mention the name Rose, and she'd heard her father say, "It was a mistake, Sarah. It meant nothing." The argument had ended abruptly, with her mother storming out of the room, leaving her father alone in the darkness. Savvy had crept back to her bed, her heart pounding with confusion and fear. She'd never seen her parents like that before, so angry, so hurt. The next morning, everything had seemed normal. Her parents had acted as if nothing had happened. But Savvy had noticed the sadness in her mother's eyes, the strain in her father's smile, and she'd never forgotten the name Rose. Now, years later, the memory took on a new significance. Rose, the woman in Colt's locket, the woman who was his mother. The woman her father had had an affair with. The secret that had been buried for so long, now unearthed, threatening to destroy everything. Savvy closed the locket, the cold metal a stark reminder of the past, of the scars that never healed. She realized that her father, the man she'd idolized, had been human, capable of mistakes, of betrayals. And she, his daughter, was now following in his footsteps, making her own choices, creating her own scars. She looked down, a glint of something wet on the locket case. Chapter 7. The Price of Loyalty. The suspension from her duties felt like a physical blow to Savvy. The badge, the symbol of her authority and her identity, had been taken from her, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She spent her days confined to her small house on the edge of town, the silence amplifying her sense of isolation and despair. Earl visited her regularly, bringing her news from the town and offering his unwavering support. He was one of the few who still believed in her, who saw beyond the rumors and accusations. "Don't you worry, Savvy," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "This will all blow over. Thompson is just grandstanding, trying to appease Stone. Once things calm down, you'll get your badge back." Savvy appreciated his optimism, but she couldn't share it. She knew that the damage to her reputation was severe, perhaps irreparable. She'd become a pariah in the town she'd sworn to protect, a victim of her own choices and the machinations of others. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, Earl arrived with a somber expression. "I've got some bad news, Savvy," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Stone has convinced the town council to hold a special election. They're going to vote on whether to permanently remove you from office." Savvy felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was worse than she'd feared. A public vote, a chance for the town to officially condemn her, to strip her of everything she'd worked for. "When is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Next week," Earl said. "They're fast-tracking it, trying to get it done before you have a chance to defend yourself." Savvy knew that she had little chance of winning. Stone's influence was too strong, the rumors too pervasive. She was facing a rigged game, a battle she was destined to lose. "I don't know what to do, Earl," she said, her voice filled with despair. "I feel like I've lost everything." Earl placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You haven't lost everything, Savvy. You still have your integrity, your courage, and your friends. And you still have me." His words touched her deeply. She'd always valued Earl's loyalty, his unwavering support, but now, more than ever, she realized how much it meant to her. "Thank you, Earl," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You do just fine, Savvy. You're a Hollister. You're strong, resilient. You'll get through this." As Earl left, Savvy felt a renewed sense of determination. She might be down, but she wasn't out. She wouldn't let Stone and Thompson win. She would fight for her reputation, for her honor, for the legacy of her father. She spent the next few days preparing for the town meeting, gathering evidence, and trying to rally support. But it was an uphill battle. Most of the townsfolk were either afraid of Stone or swayed by the rumors. She felt like she was fighting a losing war. One afternoon, as she was sitting on her porch, lost in thought, she saw a figure approaching in the distance. It was a man, riding a horse, his silhouette familiar against the setting sun. As he drew closer, she recognized him. Colt. Her heart leaped with a mixture of surprise, relief, and trepidation. What was he doing here? He was supposed to be gone, starting a new life, far away from redemption. He dismounted, his movements graceful and confident. He approached her, his eyes searching hers. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice low and concerned. "I came back to help." Savvy stared at him, speechless. He'd risked everything, his freedom, his new life, to come back for her. It was a gesture of loyalty that defied logic, that went against everything she believed about him. "You shouldn't be here, Colt," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "It's too dangerous. They're looking for you." "I don't care," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not going to let them destroy you. You're my sister, Savvy. And I'm not going to abandon you." His words, his presence, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in days. She'd been so alone, so isolated, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on her side, someone who cared. "But what can you do?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "They'll arrest you on sight." He smiled, a confident, almost reckless smile. "I have a plan," he said. "But I need your help." He outlined his plan, a daring, audacious scheme that involved confronting Stone and Thompson, exposing their corruption, and revealing the truth about her father's past. It was a risky plan, full of potential pitfalls, but it was also her only hope. Savvy hesitated. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could put both of their lives at risk. But she also knew that it was the only way to clear her name, to reclaim her honor, to fight for the justice she believed in. It was up to her. She looked toward the ever-darkening horizon. Chapter 8. Between Law and Desire. The decision to trust Colt, to join forces with an outlaw, was the most difficult Savvy had ever made. It went against every principle she held dear, every lesson her father had taught her. But she also knew that she was out of options, that Colt was her only hope of clearing her name and exposing the corruption that had taken root in redemption. The plan was simple in its audacity, but complex in its execution. Colt intended to use his knowledge of the town's secrets, his connections with the less savory elements of the frontier, to gather evidence against Stone and Thompson. He would then present this evidence at the town meeting, turning the tables on his accusers and revealing the truth about their own misdeeds. Savvy's role was to provide legitimacy, to use her remaining influence and her knowledge of the law to ensure that Colt's revelations were taken seriously. She would also be the one to confront Stone and Thompson directly, challenging their authority and demanding justice. It was a dangerous dance, a delicate balance between law and outlaw, between duty and desire. Savvy found herself increasingly drawn to Colt, not just as a brother, but as a man. His courage, his loyalty, his unwavering support were qualities she admired, qualities she found irresistible. They spent hours together, planning their strategy, sharing their stories, and discovering a connection that went beyond their shared blood. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their regrets. Savvy learned about Colt's life on the run, the hardships he'd endured, the choices he'd made. He learned about her unwavering commitment to the law, her struggle to live up to her father's legacy, her loneliness. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding that transcended their different paths. They were two sides of the same coin, two halves of a broken family, drawn together by fate and circumstance. The nights were the hardest. They would sit on her porch, watching the stars, the silence punctuated by the sounds of the desert. The tension between them was palpable, a magnetic force that drew them closer, even as they tried to resist. One night, as they were sitting side by side, Colt turned to her, his eyes dark and intense in the moonlight. "You know," he said softly, "this isn't how I imagined things would be." Savvy looked at him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" I always thought we'd be enemies," he said. "That we'd be on opposite sides of the law, forever fighting each other." "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. "Now I don't know what we are," he said. "But I know that I care about you, Savvy. More than I ever thought possible." His touch sent a shiver through her, a wave of longing that she couldn't deny. She leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his. "I care about you too, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "But this is complicated." "Complicated is my middle name," he said with a wry smile. "But sometimes the most complicated things are the most worthwhile." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. She knew she should stop him, that this was wrong, that it went against everything she believed in. But she couldn't. She wanted this, wanted him, with a desperation that defied logic and reason. Their lips met, a tentative, hesitant kiss at first, then deepening with a passion that consumed them both. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of regret, of forbidden desire. It was a kiss that blurred the lines between law and outlaw, between brother and sister, between right and wrong. Savvy pulled away, breathless, her heart pounding. "We can't," she whispered, her voice filled with guilt and confusion. "This isn't right." Colt looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and understanding. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But it feels right. And maybe that's all that matters." He kissed her again, and this time, she didn't resist. She surrendered to the moment, to the passion, to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them since the day they met. It was a reckless, dangerous act, but it was also the most exhilarating, the most alive she'd felt in years. As the night deepened, they held each other close, finding solace and comfort in each other's arms. They knew that their time together was limited, that the dawn would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for now, in this moment, they were together, and that was all that mattered. Savvy knew tomorrow would bring chaos. But she was no longer as terrified. Chapter 9. A Town Divided. The day of the town meeting arrived with a palpable sense of tension hanging over redemption. The saloon, chosen as the venue, was packed with residents, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and apprehension. Jedediah Stone and Judge Thompson sat at a table on the raised platform, their expressions smug and confident. They believed they had orchestrated Savvy's downfall, that the town was firmly on their side. Savvy and Colt arrived separately, their presence causing a stir among the crowd. Savvy, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, projected an image of strength and determination, despite the turmoil she felt inside. Colt, dressed in clean but worn clothes, his usual outlaw swagger tempered by a newfound seriousness, stood near the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd, assessing the mood. The meeting began with Stone launching into a tirade against Savvy, recounting her failures as sheriff, her incompetence in handling the Callahan case, and her alleged collusion with the outlaw. He painted a picture of a woman unfit for office, a woman who had betrayed the trust of the town. The crowd listened, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Stone's rhetoric was powerful, his influence undeniable. He had carefully cultivated his image as the town's benefactor, the man who had brought prosperity and order to redemption. Judge Thompson followed, reinforcing Stone's accusations and emphasizing the need for a strong, decisive leader, someone who would uphold the law without compromise. He subtly hinted at the possibility of criminal charges against Savvy, further raising the stakes. When it was Savvy's turn to speak, she rose slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room. She saw faces filled with doubt, with suspicion, with outright hostility. But she also saw a few faces that offered a glimmer of hope, faces that reflected trust, respect, and even support. "I stand before you today," she began, her voice clear and steady, not as a criminal, but as a woman who has dedicated her life to serving this town, to upholding the law, to protecting its citizens. She recounted her years of service, the sacrifices she'd made, the dangers she'd faced. She spoke of her father's legacy, of his unwavering commitment to justice, of the values he'd instilled in her. "I admit," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "that I made a mistake. I let Colt Callahan escape. But I did it for a reason that goes beyond the law, a reason that touches the very core of who I am." She paused, taking a deep breath, steeling herself for the revelation that was to come. "Colt Callahan," she said, her voice ringing out across the room, "is my brother." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Stone and Thompson looked stunned, their smug expressions replaced by shock and disbelief. Savvy continued, telling the story of her father's affair, of Rose, of the locket, of the secret that had been hidden for so long. She spoke of her struggle to reconcile her duty with her newfound family, of her decision to help Colt, to give him a chance at a new life. "I know I broke the law," she said, her voice filled with regret. "But I did what I believed was right. I chose family over duty, love over law. And I'm not ashamed of that." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. The crowd was silent, stunned by her confession, by the revelation of a truth that shattered their preconceived notions. Then, Colt stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "I am her brother. And I'm here to tell you that everything you've heard about Savvy, about her being incompetent, about her being in league with me, is a lie." He launched into his own account, revealing Stone's and Thompson's corrupt practices, their manipulation of the law, their exploitation of the town for their own personal gain. He presented evidence he'd gathered, documents, testimonies, and witnesses, exposing their web of deceit. He spoke of Stone's illegal land grabs, his intimidation of smaller ranchers, his bribery of officials. He spoke of Thompson's biased rulings, his favoritism towards the wealthy, his willingness to overlook justice for personal profit. The crowd listened, their initial shock giving way to anger and outrage. They had been betrayed, not by Savvy, but by the men they had trusted, the men who had claimed to be their protectors. As Colt spoke, the tide began to turn. The whispers of doubt and suspicion shifted, turning against Stone and Thompson. The faces that had been filled with hostility towards Savvy now reflected understanding, even admiration. The town was divided, split between those who still clung to the old order, to the power and influence of Stone and Thompson, and those who were ready for change, for justice, for a new beginning. The meeting, which had begun as a condemnation of Savvy, was rapidly transforming. Chapter 10. The Heart's Reckoning. The tension in the saloon was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colt's accusations had thrown the room into chaos, dividing the townsfolk into factions, their loyalties and beliefs clashing like thunder. Stone, his face a mask of fury, jumped to his feet, attempting to regain control. "This is preposterous," he bellowed. "This outlaw is lying. He's trying to deflect blame, to save his own skin." Thompson, his usual composure shattered, echoed Stone's denials, accusing Colt of fabricating evidence and manipulating the townspeople. But Colt stood his ground, unflappable, presenting piece after piece of evidence, building a damning case against the two men. He produced documents showing Stone's illegal land transactions, testimonies from ranchers who had been intimidated and cheated, and even a ledger detailing Thompson's bribes. The crowd was in an uproar, shouting questions, accusations, and demands for justice. The carefully orchestrated plan to remove Savvy from office had backfired spectacularly, turning into a public trial of Stone and Thompson. Savvy watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. She'd taken a huge risk, trusting Colt, revealing her family secret, and challenging the established order. And now, it seemed, her gamble was paying off. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. Stone and Thompson were powerful men, with deep pockets and influential connections. They wouldn't go down without a fight. As the chaos reached its peak, Savvy stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din enough. She shouted, "We've heard the accusations. We've seen the evidence. It's time for answers." She turned to Stone and Thompson, her gaze unwavering. "Did you, or did you not, engage in the illegal activities that Colt Callahan has described?" Stone spluttered, his face turning purple with rage. I deny everything. This is a conspiracy, a plot to ruin me." Thompson, his voice trembling, echoed Stone's denials, claiming that the evidence was forged, that Colt was a liar and a manipulator. But the crowd was no longer buying it. They had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and they were demanding accountability. "Answer the questions, Stone." Someone shouted from the back of the room. "Tell the truth, Thompson." Another yelled. The pressure mounted, the crowd growing increasingly restless. Stone and Thompson looked cornered, their carefully constructed facades crumbling around them. Then, a voice spoke up from the crowd, a voice that Savvy recognized. It was Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the general store, a woman known for her honesty and integrity. "I saw Stone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I saw him threaten Old Man Miller, forcing him to sell his land for a pittance. I was afraid to speak up before, but I can't stay silent any longer." Her testimony was a turning point. Other witnesses came forward, corroborating Colt's accusations and adding their own stories of Stone's and Thompson's corruption. The dam had broken, and the truth was flooding out. Stone, seeing his empire collapsing, made a desperate move. He pulled a gun, pointing it at Colt. "You've ruined me, Callahan," he screamed. "But you won't live to see it." Before anyone could react, a shot rang out. But it wasn't Stone's gun that fired. It was Savvy's. She'd drawn her own Colt, her aim steady and true. The bullet struck Stone's arm, knocking the gun from his hand. He cried out in pain, clutching his wounded arm. The room fell silent, stunned by Savvy's swift and decisive action. She had saved Colt's life, risking her own in the process. Earl and several other men quickly disarmed Stone and took him into custody. Thompson, seeing his ally defeated, surrendered without a fight. The meeting was over. The town had spoken. Justice, it seemed, had finally prevailed. As the crowd dispersed, their voices buzzing with excitement and relief, Savvy and Colt found themselves alone on the platform. They looked at each other, a mixture of exhaustion and elation in their eyes. "We did it," Savvy said, her voice filled with emotion. "We actually did it." Colt smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "We did," he said. "Together." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and reassuring, sending a shiver through her. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. "Now," he said, "we face the future. Together." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their partnership, their love. It was a kiss that promised a new beginning, a new life, free from the shadows of the past. The town was quiet, and the dust was settling, literally. Chapter 11. Masks and Mirages. The immediate aftermath of the town meeting was a whirlwind of activity. Stone and Thompson were formally arrested, charged with multiple counts of corruption, fraud, and intimidation. The territorial governor, alerted to the situation, sent a special prosecutor to Redemption to oversee the case and ensure a fair trial. Savvy, her name cleared and her reputation restored, was reinstated as sheriff, receiving a unanimous vote of confidence from the town council. She accepted the position with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to rebuild trust and restore justice to Redemption. Colt, despite his role in exposing Stone and Thompson, was still technically an outlaw. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and Savvy's impassioned plea on his behalf, the special prosecutor agreed to grant him a temporary amnesty, pending a full review of his case. The town of Redemption, once divided by suspicion and fear, began to heal. The exposure of Stone's and Thompson's corruption had shaken the community to its core, but it had also brought people together, uniting them in a common cause. Savvy and Colt, their bond forged in the crucible of adversity, found themselves working side by side to rebuild the town, to create a more just and equitable society. They were an unlikely pair, the law-abiding sheriff and the reformed outlaw, but their partnership was surprisingly effective. Their relationship, however, remained a complex and delicate matter. The passion that had flared between them during the crisis had not diminished, but they both knew that pursuing a romantic relationship was fraught with challenges. They were, after all, half-siblings, a fact that could not be ignored, a taboo that cast a long shadow over their desires. They tried to maintain a professional distance, focusing on their work, on rebuilding the town, on helping those who had been wronged by Stone and Thompson. But the attraction between them was undeniable, a magnetic force that pulled them together, despite their best efforts to resist. They found themselves stealing glances, exchanging lingering touches, their conversations often laced with unspoken longing. The nights were the hardest, when they were alone with their thoughts, their desires, their regrets. One evening, as they were working late in the sheriff's office, reviewing case files and planning their next steps, Savvy found herself staring at Colt, her gaze drawn to the way the lamplight played on his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes. He looked up, catching her gaze. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart flutter. "What?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Savvy blushed, looking away. "Nothing," she said, trying to sound casual. "Just thinking." "About?" He pressed, his gaze unwavering. She hesitated, unsure whether to voice her thoughts, her feelings. But the silence was becoming unbearable, the tension between them too thick to ignore. "About us," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "What about us, Savvy?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation that was long overdue. "We can't keep pretending," she said. "We can't keep ignoring what's between us." "I know," he said softly. "But what can we do? We're who we are." "I don't know," she said, her voice filled with frustration and despair. "But I can't keep living like this, pretending that I don't feel anything for you." He stood up, walking over to her, his presence filling the small office. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. "I feel it too, Savvy," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I feel it every time I look at you, every time I touch you. But it's wrong," she finished for him, her voice choked with tears. "It's forbidden." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It is," he said. "But that doesn't make it any less real." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative, hesitant kiss, a test of the boundaries, a questioning of the limits. Savvy responded, her own desire overcoming her reservations, her guilt. She kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a release of pent-up emotions, a surrender to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them for so long. But as the kiss ended, reality came crashing back down. They pulled apart, breathless, their eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. This kiss was a mistake, a line had been crossed, a line neither wanted to admit. "We can't," Savvy whispered, her voice trembling. "We just can't." Colt nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said. "But I don't know how to stop." They stood there, locked in a silent embrace, their hearts torn between desire and duty, between love and the harsh reality of their situation. A mirage of what could be, if not for the truth. Chapter 12. Under a Blood Moon. The uneasy truce between their desires and their reality held for a while, fragile as spun glass. Savvy and Colt continued their work, rebuilding redemption, their shared purpose a shield against the turbulent emotions that threatened to consume them. But the tension remained, an unspoken undercurrent that flowed between them, coloring every interaction, every glance, every touch. The upcoming trial of Stone and Thompson loomed large, a constant reminder of the events that had brought them together and the secrets that still lay buried. The special prosecutor, a meticulous and determined man named Elias Thorne, was building a strong case, gathering evidence, and interviewing witnesses. He was impressed by Savvy's integrity and her dedication to justice, and he relied heavily on her knowledge of the town and its people. Colt, despite his amnesty, was still viewed with suspicion by some, his outlaw past a shadow that he couldn't entirely shake off. He worked tirelessly to prove his worth, assisting Savvy in her investigations, providing valuable insights into the criminal underworld that had once been his domain. One evening, a rare and ominous event occurred, a blood moon, a total lunar eclipse that bathed the desert in an eerie, reddish glow. The townsfolk, superstitious by nature, saw it as a bad omen, a sign of impending trouble. Savvy and Colt, working late in the sheriff's office, watched the eclipse through the window, the strange light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. "They say a blood moon brings out the worst in people," Savvy said, her voice a little uneasy. "That it stirs up hidden passions, unleashes dark desires." Colt looked at her, his eyes reflecting the reddish glow. "Maybe they're right," he said softly. "Maybe it does." The tension between them, always present, intensified under the blood moon's strange influence. They found themselves drawn to each other, their bodies gravitating closer, their gazes locking with an intensity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. We should get back to work," Savvy said, her voice a little breathless, trying to break the spell. "Should we?" Colt asked, his voice a low murmur, his eyes searching hers. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, sending shivers down her spine. She didn't pull away, her body frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile her desires with her sense of what was right. "Colt," she whispered, her voice a plea, a warning, a surrender. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss that held all the unspoken longing, all the forbidden passion, all the years of yearning that had built up between them. Savvy responded, her own desire overcoming her reservations, her guilt. She kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate. It was a release of pent-up emotions, a surrender to the irresistible force that had drawn them together since the day they met. But as the kiss ended, a sudden noise startled them. A gunshot, echoing through the quiet night. They pulled apart, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. Trouble. The blood moon's omen had come true. Savvy grabbed her Colt, her sheriff's instincts kicking in. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm. "I'll check it out." "No," Colt said, his own gun already in his hand. "I'm going with you." They stepped out into the eerie, red-lit night, their senses on high alert. The town was eerily silent, the usual sounds of saloons and laughter replaced by an unsettling quiet. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. As they approached the main street, they saw a group of men gathered outside the Golden Nugget Saloon. It was Stone's men, the ones who had remained loyal to him, even after his arrest. They were armed and dangerous, their faces illuminated by the blood moon, their expressions filled with anger and desperation. "They're here for Stone," Colt said, his voice low and grim. "They're going to try to break him out." Savvy knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She had a duty to protect the town, to uphold the law, even if it meant risking her life. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. The blood moon hung heavy in the sky, casting its eerie glow on the scene unfolding below. A showdown was inevitable, a clash between law and outlaw, between loyalty and betrayal, between love and duty. The desert held its breath. The town was silent. Chapter 13. The Weight of Secrets. The standoff outside the Golden Nugget Saloon was a powder keg waiting to explode. Stone's men, fueled by desperation and the blood moon's unsettling influence, were ready to fight. Savvy and Colt, standing side by side, were determined to stop them, even if it meant risking their lives. "Drop your weapons," Savvy shouted, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. "This is your last warning." The leader of Stone's gang, a burly man named Bart, sneered. "You ain't got the numbers, Sheriff. It's just you and that outlaw. We're taking Stone back." "You'll have to go through us," Colt said, his voice low and menacing, his gun leveled at Bart. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. The blood moon cast long, distorted shadows, making the scene even more surreal. "Don't be fools," Savvy said, trying to reason with them. "Stone is guilty. He'll face justice. There's no point in risking your lives for him." But Bart and his men were beyond reason. They were loyal to Stone, and they were determined to free him, no matter the cost. "We ain't afraid to die," Bart said, his eyes filled with a fanatical gleam. "We're taking Stone back, one way or another." He raised his gun, and the others followed suit. A gunfight was inevitable. Savvy and Colt braced themselves, their fingers tightening on their triggers. They were outnumbered, but they were also more skilled, more experienced. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence. It was Bart, firing at Colt. But Colt was faster, dodging the bullet and returning fire. The gunfight erupted, a chaotic dance of bullets and bodies. Savvy and Colt moved with a practiced ease, their movements synchronized, their aim true. They were a formidable team, their skills complementing each other, their bond strengthening with every shot fired. Savvy took down 2 of Stone's men, her shots precise and deadly. Colt, with his outlaw instincts and his knowledge of the gang's tactics, managed to disarm another 2. But there were too many of them. Bart and the remaining men kept pressing forward, their desperation fueled by the Blood Moon's madness. One of Stone's men managed to get behind Savvy, aiming his gun at her back. Colt saw him, his eyes widening in alarm. "Savvy," he shouted, pushing her out of the way just as the man fired. The bullet grazed Colt's arm, drawing blood, but he didn't flinch. He turned and fired, taking down the man who had tried to kill Savvy. Savvy, shaken but unharmed, rushed to Colt's side. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," he said, his voice strained with pain. "Just a scratch." But she could see that it was more than just a scratch. The bullet had torn through his flesh, and he was bleeding heavily. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice urgent. "No time," he said, his gaze fixed on Bart, who was still standing, his gun leveled at them. "We have to finish this." He raised his gun, his hand trembling, his strength fading. But before he could fire, a shot rang out from somewhere else. Bart crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. He was dead. Savvy and Colt looked around, trying to see who had fired the shot. Then they saw him. It was Earl, standing on the roof of the saloon, his rifle still smoking. He'd been watching the gunfight, waiting for the right moment to intervene. He'd saved their lives. With Bart dead, the remaining members of Stone's gang lost their nerve. They dropped their weapons and surrendered, their faces filled with fear and resignation. The gunfight was over. The Blood Moon's madness had subsided, leaving behind a trail of blood and destruction. Savvy rushed to Colt's side, helping him to sit down. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and bandaged his wound, her hands trembling. "You saved my life," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You saved mine too," he said softly. "We look out for each other." Earl climbed down from the roof, his face etched with relief. "You two all right?" he asked, his voice gruff. "We're alive," Savvy said, her voice weary. "Thanks to you." Earl nodded, his gaze lingering on Colt's wound. "Let's get you to the dock, son," he said. "That needs proper tending." As they helped Colt to his feet, Savvy couldn't help but think about the secrets that still lay buried, the weight of their shared past, the forbidden desire that still simmered between them. The Blood Moon had brought out the worst in people, but it had also revealed the strength of their bond, the depth of their loyalty, the undeniable truth of their feelings. But what next? That was the true dilemma. She glanced down the street. Chapter 14. Echoes of Gunfire. The aftermath of the gunfight was a somber affair. Bart and 2 of Stone's other men were dead, several others were wounded, and the town of Redemption was once again shaken by violence. Savvy, despite her exhaustion and the emotional turmoil she was experiencing, took charge, organizing the care of the wounded, securing the prisoners, and ensuring that order was restored. Colt, his arm bandaged and his strength slowly returning, insisted on helping, despite Savvy's protests. He felt responsible for the violence, for putting Savvy and Earl in danger. He knew that his past, his reputation as an outlaw, had contributed to the chaos. The town's doctor, a weary but capable man named Dr. Miller, worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, both the outlaws and the townsfolk who had been caught in the crossfire. He tended to Colt's arm, cleaning and stitching the wound, assuring Savvy that it would heal, though it would likely leave a scar. As Dr. Miller worked, Savvy sat beside Colt, holding his hand, her presence a silent reassurance. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for his courage, his loyalty, his willingness to risk his life for her. She also felt a profound sadness, a sense of the impossible situation they were in, their love for each other overshadowed by the reality of their kinship. "I'm sorry, Savvy," Colt said, his voice weak but sincere. "I never wanted to bring this kind of trouble to your town." Savvy squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with compassion. "It's not your fault, Colt," she said. "You were trying to help. You saved my life." "But I'm an outlaw," he said, his voice filled with self-recrimination. "I'm a magnet for trouble. I always have been." "You're more than that, Colt," she said firmly. "You're my brother. And you're a good man, despite your past." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," she said, her voice unwavering. "I see the good in you, Colt. I see the man you could be, the man you're trying to be." Her words touched him deeply. He'd spent so much of his life being defined by his past, by his mistakes, that he'd almost forgotten that he was capable of anything else. Savvy's belief in him, her unwavering support, was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As the night wore on, and the town slowly settled back into an uneasy calm, Savvy and Colt found themselves alone in the sheriff's office. The echoes of gunfire still lingered in the air, a reminder of the violence they had witnessed, the lives that had been lost. "What happens now, Savvy?" Colt asked, his voice weary. "With Stone, with the trial, with us?" Savvy sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Stone will face justice," she said. "The special prosecutor is determined to see him convicted. And Thompson, too." "And what about me?" he asked, his gaze intense. "Will I face justice, too?" Savvy looked at him, her heart aching. She knew that his amnesty was temporary, that his future was uncertain. "I don't know, Colt," she said honestly. "I'll do everything I can to help you, to argue for your freedom. But ultimately, it's up to the prosecutor, to the judge." He nodded, his expression somber. He understood the risks, the consequences of his past actions. "And what about us?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. Savvy turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. "I don't know, Colt," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know." She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet town, the blood moon now a fading memory in the pre-dawn sky. She felt torn, pulled in two different directions, her heart and her mind at war. She loved Colt, she couldn't deny that. But she also knew that their love was forbidden, that it could never be. They were siblings, bound by blood, separated by a chasm of societal norms and moral constraints. Colt came up behind her, his presence a warm comfort. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his closeness, his unspoken understanding. Maybe there's no future for us, Savvy," he said softly. "Maybe we're just meant to be what we are. Brother and sister. Partners in rebuilding this town." His words were a painful truth, a recognition of the reality they couldn't escape. But they also offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility of a different kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a bond that transcended the forbidden. Savvy turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice trembling. "Maybe that's all we can be." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that a part of her would always yearn for something more, something that could never be. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the quiet ache of a love that was both profound and impossible. The sun was beginning to rise. Chapter 15. A Dance with Danger. The trial of Jedediah Stone and Judge Thompson was the biggest event in Redemption's history. The town was abuzz with anticipation, the saloons overflowing with spectators, and the streets filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The special prosecutor, Elias Thorne had meticulously built his case, gathering overwhelming evidence of the two men's corruption and their abuse of power. Savvy, as the sheriff, played a crucial role in the proceedings, providing testimony, ensuring order in the courtroom, and working closely with Thorne to ensure that justice was served. Colt, despite his ambiguous legal status, was also a key witness, his first-hand knowledge of Stone's and Thompson's operations proving invaluable. The trial lasted for several days, each day filled with dramatic revelations, tense cross-examinations, and impassioned arguments. Stone and Thompson, represented by a team of high-priced lawyers from back east, maintained their innocence, claiming that they were victims of a conspiracy orchestrated by Colt and Savvy. But their defense was weak, crumbling under the weight of the evidence and the testimony of numerous witnesses, including many of the townspeople who had once been afraid to speak out. Mrs. Henderson, the owner of the general store, delivered a particularly damning testimony, recounting Stone's intimidation tactics and Thompson's biased rulings. Colt's testimony was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial. He recounted his life as an outlaw, his dealings with Stone and Thompson, and his eventual decision to turn against them and help Savvy. He spoke with a quiet intensity, his words carrying the weight of truth and regret. He admitted his own past mistakes, his involvement in illegal activities, but he also emphasized his desire for redemption, his commitment to helping Savvy rebuild redemption and create a more just society. He spoke of his newfound understanding of the law, of the importance of upholding justice, even when it was difficult. His words resonated with the townspeople, many of whom had initially viewed him with suspicion and distrust. They saw in him a reflection of their own struggles, their own desires for a better life, a better future. Savvy, watching Colt testify, felt a surge of pride and admiration. He had come a long way from the reckless outlaw she had once known. He had grown, matured, and embraced a new path, a path of redemption and responsibility. But she also felt a pang of sadness, a reminder of the impossible barrier that still separated them. They were siblings, bound by blood, their love for each other forever tainted by the taboo of their kinship. During the trial, Savvy and Colt continued their delicate dance, navigating the treacherous waters of their forbidden desire. They worked together closely, their professional partnership masking the deeper emotions that simmered beneath the surface. They stole glances, exchanged brief touches, their conversations often laced with unspoken longing. The nights were the hardest, when they were alone with their thoughts, their desires, their regrets. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, they found themselves alone in the sheriff's office. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken emotions. "This trial, it's bringing everything back," Savvy said, her voice weary. "All the pain, all the secrets, all the feelings." Colt nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said softly. "It's like opening old wounds." He walked over to her, his presence filling the small office. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. "I can't stop thinking about you, Savvy," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "About us. About what could have been." Savvy leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body betraying her desire. "I know," she whispered. "Me too." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative, hesitant kiss, a test of the boundaries, a questioning of the limits. Savvy responded, her own desire overcoming her reservations, her guilt. She kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a release of pent-up emotions, a surrender to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them for too long and always would. But as the kiss ended, a sudden noise startled them. A knock on the door. They pulled apart, breathless, their eyes filled with a mixture of longing and guilt. Reality, once again, intruded upon their fragile moment of intimacy. It was Earl, his face etched with concern. "Sorry to interrupt, Savvy," he said, "but there's trouble." He paused, casting a look at Colt. "It appears some of Stone's men that we didn't catch are angling to cause problems. Again." The dance was not yet over, it seemed. Savvy sighed. Chapter 16. Truths Unveiled. The news of more trouble brewing, courtesy of Stone's remaining loyalists, cast a pall over Savvy and Colt's already complicated situation. The fragile peace they had fought so hard to achieve in redemption was once again threatened, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on Savvy's shoulders. What kind of trouble, Earl? Savvy asked, her voice regaining its authoritative edge, the sheriff replacing the woman caught in a whirlwind of forbidden emotions. Earl shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering between Savvy and Colt. Seems they're planning to disrupt the trial, he said. Heard whispers of them trying to intimidate witnesses, maybe even break Stone out again. Colt's jaw tightened. They won't get away with it, he said, his voice low and determined. We stopped them once, we'll stop them again. Savvy nodded, her mind already racing, formulating a plan. We need to increase security at the courthouse, she said. And we need to find out who's leading this, where they're hiding. Earl nodded. I've already put extra men on patrol, he said. And I've got some informants working on it, trying to get some intel. Good, Savvy said. We need to be proactive, anticipate their moves. As they discussed the situation, laying out their strategy, the unspoken tension between Savvy and Colt remained, a subtle undercurrent that colored their interactions. The kiss they had shared, the emotions it had unleashed, hung in the air between them, a reminder of the forbidden desire that they couldn't escape. But they pushed those feelings aside, focusing on the immediate threat, on protecting the town, on ensuring that justice was served. They were partners, siblings, bound by duty and a shared purpose, and they would face this challenge together, as they had faced so many others. Over the next few days, the tension in redemption ratcheted up. The trial continued, with Stone and Thompson growing increasingly desperate as the evidence against them mounted. The threat from Stone's loyalists loomed large, casting a shadow of fear and uncertainty over the town. Savvy and Colt worked tirelessly, coordinating security, gathering intelligence, and preparing for any eventuality. They were a formidable team, their skills and instincts complementing each other, their bond strengthening with every challenge they faced. One evening, as they were working late in the sheriff's office, reviewing reports and maps, Earl burst in, his face flushed with excitement. I've got something, he said, his voice breathless. My informants, they've located Stone's men. They're holed up in the old abandoned mine, just outside of town. Savvy and Colt exchanged a look. This was it. The showdown they had been anticipating. How many? Savvy asked, her voice calm and steady. At least a dozen, Earl said. Heavily armed. Savvy nodded, her mind racing. We need to move quickly, she said, before they can make a move against the town. She turned to Colt. Are you with me? She asked, her gaze searching his. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. Always, he said, his voice unwavering. They gathered their men, a small but loyal force of deputies and volunteers, and rode out to the abandoned mine, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert landscape. As they approached the mine, they could hear the sounds of activity, the voices of Stone's men, the clatter of weapons. They dismounted, taking cover behind rocks and bushes, preparing for a confrontation. Savvy, Herr Colstron, addressed Hermann. We're here to uphold the law, she said, her voice clear and strong. To protect this town. To ensure that justice is served. We'll give them one chance to surrender. If they refuse, we do what we have to do. She stepped out into the open, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. This is Sheriff Hollister, she shouted. You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up. A moment of silence, then a voice, harsh and defiant, echoed from the mine. We ain't surrendering, Sheriff. You'll have to come in and get us. Savvy knew that a gunfight was inevitable. She'd hoped to avoid bloodshed, but Stone's men were too desperate, too fanatical. Take cover, she shouted, and the shooting began. The battle was fierce and brutal, the echoes of gunfire reverberating through the hills. Savvy and Colt fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their aim true. They were a force to be reckoned with, their combined skills and their unwavering determination proving too much for Stone's men. One by one, the outlaws fell, until finally, only a handful remained, holed up inside the mine. Savvy, Colt, and Earl, along with a few other deputies, cautiously entered the mine, their guns drawn, their senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and dust, the darkness punctuated by the flickering light of their lanterns. They moved slowly, carefully, clearing each tunnel and chamber. Finally, they reached the main cavern, where the remaining outlaws were making their last stand. A final, desperate gunfight erupted, the confined space amplifying the sound and the fury. Savvy and Colt fought with courage and skill, taking down the remaining outlaws, ending the threat once and for all. As the echoes of gunfire faded and the dust settled, a profound silence descended upon the mine. The battle was over. Stone's last stand had failed. But as Savvy surveyed the scene, she noticed something, or rather, someone missing. One of the outlaws, a man named Silas, known for his cunning and his ruthlessness, was nowhere to be found. "Silas," she said, her voice filled with alarm. "He's not here." Colt's eyes widened. "He must have escaped," he said. "Slipped away during the chaos." They searched the mine, but Silas was gone. He had vanished into the night, a ghost, a threat still lurking in the shadows. The victory felt hollow, incomplete. Silas was still out there, a danger to Savvy, to the town, to everything they had fought for. The truth was unveiled, but not completely settled. Chapter 17. The Sheriff's Dilemma. The escape of Silas, one of Stone's most trusted and dangerous lieutenants, cast a long shadow over the victory at the mine. Savvy knew that he wouldn't just disappear. He was driven by a loyalty to Stone and a thirst for revenge, and he would undoubtedly seek to undermine the trial, to harm Savvy, or worse. The immediate concern was the security of the remaining witnesses and the integrity of the trial itself. Savvy, with Colt and Earl's help, implemented even tighter security measures, placing guards around the courthouse and the homes of key witnesses. They also launched a manhunt for Silas, sending out posses and telegrams to neighboring towns, hoping to apprehend him before he could cause any more trouble. The trial, meanwhile, was drawing to a close. The prosecution had presented a damning case against Stone and Thompson, and the defense had been unable to mount any credible challenge. The jury was expected to deliver a verdict soon, and the tension in redemption was palpable. Despite the looming threat of Silas and the pressure of the trial, Savvy found herself increasingly preoccupied with her personal dilemma, her forbidden feelings for Colt. The closer they worked together, the more their bond deepened, the more difficult it became to ignore the undeniable attraction between them. They continued their delicate dance, their professional partnership masking the deeper emotions that simmered beneath the surface. They stole glances, exchanged brief touches, their conversations often laced with unspoken longing. The nights were the hardest, when they were alone with their thoughts, their desires, their regrets. One evening, as they were walking back to Savvy's house after a long day at the courthouse, Colt stopped, turning to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. "Savvy," he said softly, "we need to talk. About us." Savvy's heart pounded. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she also dreaded it. She didn't know how to reconcile her feelings for him with the reality of their situation. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"But I don't know what to say."
"We can't keep pretending," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "We can't keep ignoring what's between us. It's tearing me apart." "Me too," she admitted, her eyes filling with tears. "But what can we do, Colt? We're siblings." "It's wrong." "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice filled with anguish. "But I can't help how I feel. I love you, Savvy. I've loved you since that night by the creek, all those years ago." His words, his confession, sent a wave of emotion through her. She'd always suspected his feelings, but to hear him say it out loud, to know that he loved her, was both exhilarating and devastating. "I love you too, Colt," she confessed, her voice choked with tears. "But it's impossible. It can never be." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Maybe," he said softly. "But maybe there's a way. Maybe we can find a way to be together, somehow." His words, his hope, were a dangerous temptation. Savvy knew that it was a foolish dream, that their love was doomed, but she couldn't help but yearn for the impossible, for a future that could never be. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't give me hope, Colt. It's too painful." He pulled her close, holding her tight, his body a warm comfort against the chill night air. "I can't help it, Savvy," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "I can't help but hope." They stood there, locked in a silent embrace, their hearts torn between desire and duty, between love and the harsh reality of their situation. The dilemma was a cruel one, a choice between their hearts and their heritage. As they held each other, a sudden sound broke the silence. A rustling in the bushes nearby. Savvy and Colt instantly tensed, their senses on high alert. They pulled apart, their hands instinctively reaching for their guns.
"Who's there?"
Savvy demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. A figure emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. It was Silas. He held a gun in his hand, pointed directly at Savvy. "You're going to pay, Sheriff," he said, his voice filled with hatred. "You're going to pay for what you did to Stone." Savvy and Colt found themselves facing a deadly threat, their personal dilemma overshadowed by the immediate danger. The sheriff's dilemma had just taken a deadly turn. This was no longer about feelings. Chapter 18. Crossroads of Fate. The sudden appearance of Silas, his gun trained on Savvy, shattered the fragile moment of intimacy between her and Colt. The forbidden desires, the unspoken longing, were instantly replaced by the cold, hard reality of survival. "Silas, drop the gun," Savvy said, her voice calm and steady, her own Colt drawn and aimed at him. "It's over. Stone is going to prison. There's nothing you can do." Silas sneered, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and desperation. "It ain't over till it's over, Sheriff," he said. "And I ain't going down without a fight. And neither are you." Colt stepped forward, positioning himself between Savvy and Silas, shielding her with his body. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice low and menacing. Silas chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. "That's what I was hoping for, Callahan," he said. "I got a score to settle with you too. You betrayed us. You betrayed Stone." "Stone betrayed himself," Colt said, his voice unwavering. "He's a corrupt, greedy man. He deserves everything he's getting. He was a good man." Silas shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "He gave us a purpose, a life. You, and that sheriff sister of yours, you ruined everything." Savvy saw the madness in Silas's eyes, the desperation that fueled his actions. He was beyond reason, beyond redemption. He was a cornered animal, ready to lash out at anything and anyone. "Silas, it's not too late," Savvy said, trying one last time to reason with him. "Put down the gun. Surrender. I'll make sure you get a fair trial." But Silas wasn't listening. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Colt reacted instantly, pushing Savvy out of the way and firing his own gun. The shot rang out, echoing through the quiet night. Silas staggered backward, his eyes widening in surprise and pain. He looked down at his chest, where a crimson stain was spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Colt, a flicker of understanding, of regret in his eyes. Then he crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. He was dead. Savvy rushed to Colt's side, her heart pounding with relief and fear. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady, though she could see the tension in his eyes, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They stood there, staring at Silas's lifeless body, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing. The threat was over, but the cost had been high. Another life lost, another layer of violence added to the already blood-soaked history of redemption. Earl and several deputies arrived, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They took in the scene, their faces grim. "What happened?" Earl asked, his gaze fixed on Silas's body. "He was waiting for us," Savvy said, her voice weary. He wanted revenge. Earl nodded, his expression somber.
He was a dangerous man, he said. You did what you had to do.
As the deputies secured the scene, Savvy and Colt found themselves alone again. The weight of their shared experience, the burden of their forbidden love, pressing down on them. It never ends, does it? Savvy said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The violence, the danger, the choices we have to make. Colt looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep understanding. No, he said. It doesn't. But we face it together. That's all we can do. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of support, of companionship, of a love that defied the boundaries of their reality. What happens now, Colt? Savvy asked, her voice barely a whisper. With us? With everything? He sighed, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. I don't know, Savvy, he said honestly. But I know this, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here, in redemption. With you. His words, his decision, sent a wave of emotion through her. Relief, gratitude, and a flicker of hope, a dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to be together, despite the impossible odds. They stood there, at a crossroads of fate, their future uncertain, their love forbidden, but their bond unbreakable. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with challenges and obstacles, but they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. The sun had not yet shown its face. Chapter 19. Redemption's Call. The death of Silas marked the end of Stone's reign of terror and redemption. The following day, the jury in the trial of Stone and Thompson returned a guilty verdict on all counts. The two men, stripped of their power and influence, were sentenced to long prison terms, their corrupt empire crumbling around them. The town of Redemption breathed a collective sigh of relief. Justice had been served, and a new chapter had begun. Savvy, her reputation not only restored but enhanced by her courage and her unwavering commitment to the law, was hailed as a hero. She had faced down outlaws, exposed corruption, and brought peace to her town. Colt, despite his past, was also recognized for his role in bringing Stone and Thompson to justice. The special prosecutor, Elias Thorne, impressed by Colt's testimony and his actions during the crisis, recommended that the charges against him be dropped. He saw in Colt a genuine desire for redemption, a willingness to turn his life around and contribute to society. The judge agreed, granting Colt a full pardon, clearing his name and freeing him from the shadow of his outlaw past. Colt was a free man, able to start a new life, to build a future free from the constraints of his former life. But the question of his relationship with Savvy remained, a complex and unresolved issue. They had confessed their love for each other, but they also knew that their love was forbidden, that it could never be fully realized. They tried to maintain a professional distance, focusing on their respective roles in rebuilding redemption. Savvy continued her work as sheriff, restoring law and order, and working to heal the divisions that had plagued the town. Colt, using his skills and knowledge, started a small ranch outside of town, raising cattle and horses and contributing to the local economy. But the attraction between them, the undeniable bond that had formed during their shared struggles, remained strong. They found themselves drawn to each other, their conversations often laced with unspoken longing, their glances lingering a little too long. One evening, as they were standing on the porch of Savvy's house, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in hues of orange and purple, Savvy turned to Colt, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Colt, she said softly, we need to decide what we're going to do. Colt nodded, his expression somber. He knew this conversation was inevitable, that they couldn't continue to live in limbo, their hearts torn between desire and duty. I know, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. But I don't know what the answer is, Savvy. We can't be together, she said, her voice trembling. Not in the way we want to be. It's not possible. He reached out, his fingers gently touching her cheek. I know, he said softly.
But that doesn't mean we can't be something. We're family, Savvy. We're brother and sister. We'll always have that.
But is that enough? She asked, her voice choked with tears. Is that enough for you? For me? He sighed, his expression filled with a mixture of longing and resignation. I don't know, he said, honestly. But I know this, I can't imagine my life without you in it, Savvy. In whatever capacity that may be. His words, his unwavering devotion, touched her deeply. She knew that he was right, that their bond, their connection, was too strong to be broken, regardless of the constraints that society placed upon them. Me neither, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can't imagine my life without you, Colt. They stood there, in a silent embrace, their hearts aching with a love that was both profound and impossible. They had found a measure of peace, a resolution of sorts, but it was a bittersweet one, tinged with the sadness of what could never be. I'll stay here, Colt said, his voice firm. In redemption. I'll build my ranch, I'll help this town, I'll be whatever you need me to be.
Savvy smiled, a sad, grateful smile. And I'll be here, she said.
As sheriff. As your sister. As your friend. They had found a way to coexist, to navigate the treacherous waters of their forbidden love. They would be family, partners, friends, bound together by their shared past, their shared purpose, and a love that, while unfulfilled in the traditional sense, would endure. Redemption had called, and they would both answer. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The months that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding for redemption. Savvy, with Colt's support, worked tirelessly to restore trust in the law, to mend the divisions that had fractured the community, and to create a more just and equitable society. Colt, true to his word, established his ranch, becoming a respected member of the community, his past as an outlaw fading into a legend, a reminder of the transformative power of redemption. Their relationship, while not the romantic one they had both secretly yearned for, evolved into a deep and abiding bond, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that transcended the conventional definitions. They were family, friends, confidants, their lives intertwined in ways that defied the constraints of their blood relation. They spent countless hours together, working side by side on town projects, sharing meals, and talking late into the night, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound. They found solace in each other's company, a comfort and understanding that they found nowhere else. But the unspoken longing, the forbidden desire, never completely vanished. It lingered beneath the surface, a subtle undercurrent that colored their interactions, a reminder of the path not taken, the love that could never be fully realized. One day, a stranger arrived in Redemption, a man named Elias Thorne, the special prosecutor who had overseen the trial of Stone and Thompson. He had returned, he explained, to tie up some loose ends, to ensure that all of Stone's assets were properly accounted for and distributed to those who had been wronged. But Thorne also had another, more personal reason for his return. He had been deeply impressed by Savvy's integrity, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. He had developed feelings for her, feelings that he had suppressed during the trial, but that he now felt compelled to express. He sought Savvy out, finding her in her office, reviewing reports. He confessed his admiration for her, his respect for her work, and his hope that they might explore a possible future together. Savvy was taken aback. She had been so focused on her work, on Colt, on rebuilding the town, that she hadn't even considered the possibility of another romantic relationship. She appreciated Thorne's honesty, his integrity, but her heart was complicated. "Mr. Thorne," she said softly, I'm flattered. You're a good man, a man of principle. But your heart belongs to another," Thorne finished for her, his voice filled with a mixture of understanding and regret. Savvy looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's complicated," she said. Thorne nodded, his expression somber. "I understand," he said. "Or, at least, I think I do. It's your brother, isn't it?" "Colt." Savvy's eyes widened in surprise. How did you know?" Thorne smiled sadly. "I saw the way you looked at each other," he said.
The way you interacted. The unspoken connection between you. It was obvious. He paused, then added, "It's a difficult situation, Sheriff. A forbidden love. But I can see that it's real. And I respect that." Savvy felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thorne understood. He didn't judge. He respected her feelings, even though they meant that he had no chance with her. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For understanding. For not judging." Thorne smiled. "I could never judge you, Sheriff," he said. "You're one of the most honorable, the most courageous women I've ever met. And I wish you happiness, whatever form that may take." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Sheriff," he said. "There's something you should know. Something I discovered while I was reviewing Stone's records." He hesitated, then continued. "It turns out Stone had a secret that he kept hidden from everyone, even his closest associates." Savvy looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What secret?" Thorne took a deep breath. "Stone had a previous marriage," he said. "A marriage that he kept secret, a marriage that produced a child."
À son.
Savvy's heart pounded.
À son?
She repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Thorne nodded. "A son who was raised in secret," he said. "A son who took the name of his stepfather. A son named Callahan." Savvy stared at him, her mind reeling. Colt. Colt was Stone's son, not her father's. They weren't siblings. The truth, the final, shocking truth, hit her like a thunderbolt. It was a revelation that changed everything, that shattered the foundations of her reality, that opened up a possibility that she had never dared to dream of. A final showdown with previous assumptions. The horizons were endless. Epilogue. The revelation of Colt's true parentage sent shockwaves through Savvy, appending everything she thought she knew about her family, about herself, and about her relationship with the man she loved. The impossible barrier, the forbidden nature of their love, had vanished, replaced by a dizzying sense of possibility, a future that had suddenly become imaginable. She found Colt at his ranch, working with his horses, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. He looked up as she approached, his eyes filled with a familiar warmth, a love that had always been there, tempered by the constraints of their supposed kinship. "Savvy," he said, his voice a soft greeting, a question, a hint of apprehension. He sensed that something was different, that something had changed. She couldn't speak, her emotions overwhelming her. She simply held out the documents that Thorne had given her, the proof of Stone's secret marriage, the evidence of Colt's true lineage. He took the papers, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes scanning the words, the dates, the names. His expression slowly changed, from confusion to disbelief to a dawning realization. This can't be," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm not Thomas Hollister's son?" Savvy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not. You're Stone's son. We're not brother and sister." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance, with the weight of years of unspoken longing, of forbidden desire. The truth, the liberating truth, had finally set them free. Colt stared at the papers, then looked up at Savvy, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, relief, and a burgeoning hope. We're not, he couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too overwhelming, too profound. He dropped the papers, his hands reaching out to her, his fingers gently touching her face, wiping away her tears. "Savvy," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. All this time we thought," she nodded, her own tears flowing freely. "I know," she whispered, "but it's not true. We're free, Colt. We're free to." She couldn't say it, the words too daunting, too filled with the promise of a future that had once seemed impossible. He understood. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was no longer forbidden, a kiss that was filled with years of pent-up longing, of suppressed desire, of a love that had finally found its expression. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, their future, their destiny. It was a kiss that promised a new beginning, a life together,
free from the shadows of the past, free from the constraints of a lie that had kept them apart for so long. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the vast expanse of the desert, Savvy and Colt stood hand in hand, their hearts overflowing with a love that was no longer forbidden, a love that was finally, truly, theirs. The town of Redemption, once a symbol of their struggles, their sacrifices, their impossible situation, now stood as a testament to their resilience, their courage, and the enduring power of love. They had faced down outlaws, exposed corruption, and rebuilt a community. But their greatest triumph, their most profound victory, was the discovery of their true selves, their true connection, and the realization of a love that had always been meant to be. The horizon stretched, not tauntingly, but invitingly.